On an ordinary morning in Bordeaux, France, the young girl Julie disappeared on her way to school, with no one noticing what had happened. Her family initially thought she had just been delayed, but as hours passed, concern grew. What started as a fleeting disappearance soon escalated into a serious case after all means of communication with her were cut off. As news spread, the police rushed to the area and search teams were deployed. However, as time passed, it became clear that the child's disappearance couldn't have been accidental. Fear began to spread among the residents, and everyone realized that Bordeaux would never be the same again. The official investigation began amidst a heightened sense of urgency, with the police focusing on gathering evidence and testimonies that might lead them to the child's whereabouts. The police enlisted the help of various agencies and asked citizens to assist in locating her. As the search team scoured the city and surrounding areas, the evidence pointed to a carefully planned kidnapping. Suspicion fell on Christian Ranucci, a man from the area whom the police had noticed earlier. The testimonies were unclear, but this man was now under suspicion. Meanwhile, the family continued to wait for news, their hearts breaking in despair. After several days of intense searching, the news that shook the city arrived. Julie's body was found in a nearby forest. The discovery of the body was not the resolution they had hoped for. Instead, it was a true tragedy, as the body showed signs of severe violence. New evidence indicated that the killing wasn't random, but rather premeditated. The police cordoned off the area, and forensic experts began to investigate the cause of the child's death. It was a turning point. All suspicions pointed to the crime being more complicated than it initially seemed. Anger began to grow within the city. The autopsy revealed that Julie had suffered multiple injuries before her death. The killing was brutal, as the child had endured both physical and psychological trauma, indicating that the perpetrator knew her well. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a calculated act of violence. The police began to focus even more on Christian Ranucci after these horrific details emerged. New evidence strengthened the suspicions against him, including testimony from the child's neighbors, who mentioned seeing him in the area on several occasions before the incident. Now, everyone was asking, who was this man and why did he do it? As the investigation deepened, Christian Ranucci emerged as one of the main suspects in Julie's kidnapping and murder. The man who had kept a low profile in the early stages of the investigation was now the focal point of the police's attention. Despite Ranucci's denial of any involvement in the crime, the evidence continued to mount against him. There were several indicators pointing to his direct involvement in the incident. The police dug into his past and found that he had a criminal record. As the pressure on him increased, a darker image of his character began to emerge. It seemed that Christian had been hiding behind a mask of innocence all along. As the evidence against Christian Ranucci continued to escalate, he was arrested in September 1976. The moment of his arrest was filled with tension. As neighbors and politicians watched the scene with questioning eyes, Ranucci maintained his innocence, claiming he had no connection to the crime, but his nervous demeanor raised suspicions about his behavior. Inside his cell, his lawyers were formulating a defense strategy, but the police were more determined than ever to prove he was the perpetrator. The accusations against him mounted quickly, both from neighbors' testimonies and forensic analyses, leaving the investigators certain that his confession was inevitable. Despite the mounting evidence, Christian Ranucci continued to deny his involvement in the murder. In the interrogation room, he insisted that he was not at the location where the child was killed. He lied through every question, but his strange behavior before the judges made them doubt his sincerity. There was undeniable evidence such as footprints near the crime scene and Julie's clothes found at Ranucci's house. As tensions rose inside the courtroom, the mystery deepened. Everyone was awaiting the revelation of the truth, but his defense team was doing everything they could to delay it. Christian Ranucci's trial began in 1977 and attracted massive media attention. The crime had captivated the French public, and all eyes were on the court. His defense lawyers did everything they could to prove his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. During this period, many disturbing details about Ranucci's personal life were revealed, including his questionable relationships with certain individuals in the city. He had been implicated in several previous cases, but this time the accusation was more serious than ever. Everyone was eager to see how the judge would handle this man. Ranucci's case wasn't just any criminal case. It was an event filled with excitement, with news of the case dominating newspapers and TV coverage. The French public was in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for more details. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, and as media pressure mounted, it became difficult for the defense to keep certain details hidden. Suspicion of Ranucci's guilt increased, and the potential for his conviction consumed everyone's thoughts. The moment of judgment was approaching, and there was little time left before the court's decision would be made. During the trial, several witnesses testified that they had seen Ranucci in the areas where Julie had been before her disappearance. They remembered seeing him in the places where the child was killed and were certain of his identity. However, Ranucci insisted that these testimonies were inaccurate and that he had been elsewhere. Despite his claims, the testimonies were consistent, making his defense appear weak. These statements became a pivotal point in the case, as the image of the perpetrator began to take shape. With each witness, public opinion turned more firmly against Ranucci, but his lawyers remained undeterred. As the evidence mounted against their client, Ranucci's defense lawyers did not stop presenting counterarguments. They tried to show that the evidence was flawed and that there might have been mistakes in the investigation. They offered alternative explanations for each piece of evidence, attempting to undermine the credibility of the witnesses. The defense team aimed to convince the judge that Ranucci might be a victim of an unfair accusation. However, as the trial progressed, it became evident that the defense was under significant pressure. As the evidence gradually confirmed his involvement in the crime, it was clear that the next few minutes in court would be crucial. In July 1977, after months of exhausting trial, the final verdict was announced in the case of Christian Ranucci. He was convicted of kidnapping and murdering young Julie, and the death penalty was the punishment to be carried out. The French community was in shock, as the case had reached its peak. The media was filled with analyses of the verdict's validity, and people questioned whether the death penalty was the right solution. However, there was a consensus that the crime was one of the most horrific tragedies to shake France at the time, before the death sentence was carried out. Christian Ranucci's defense lawyers filed an appeal, hoping to overturn the verdict. They argued that there were serious doubts about the court's ruling, especially concerning certain legal points that hadn't been properly evaluated. This was their last attempt to save their client from execution, but the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. Everyone was awaiting the final outcome, and the decision was harsh. In those moments, the very image of justice in France was at stake, and Ranucci's fate became clear. On November 28, 1976, Christian Ranucci was executed in Bordeaux prison. This was a pivotal moment in French history, as it was the last execution before the abolition of the death penalty in the country. Newspapers and magazines focused on this historic moment, with all eyes watching how the story of a man whose name would forever be linked to France's history would come to an end. At that moment, everyone questioned the legitimacy of the death penalty and its future impact on French society. The execution of Christian Ranucci marked the end of a long era of capital punishment in France. After his execution, the death penalty was abolished legally in 1981. This change was a significant step in the development of French law, and Ranucci's case became one of the most controversial in the history of French justice. That moment remains etched in memory as one of the most influential moments in the history of criminal law in France. Source of the true story. This crime took place in 1976 in Bordeaux, France, and the case was closed with the execution of Christian Ranucci that same year. The death penalty was abolished in France in 1981, making Ranucci's execution the last case of capital punishment in the country.